Yeah, this is about speech, which is, I find, a natural complement to NLP, and it's also quite a nice complement actually to the preceding talk. Very nice indeed. I have to right away make an apology. Today I will only be able to demonstrate 6 of the promised dialects. One just didn't make it in time. The Valais dialect, by the way, which is, you know. A few words about the project background. I myself have worked my entire professional life in TTS, and so towards the end of my professional career, it was just high time to finally attack Swiss German as my native language. So we started as a commercial setup in 2015, and we have been treating Swiss German TTS since 2017. Just a general remark here, TTS is usually highly underestimated in its complexity and difficulty, especially compared to ASR. It's not at all easy, and for Swiss German the challenge is much bigger than for Standard German. I can believe me, I cursed many times. And the reason is, you know, that dialects are not standardized neither in phonetics nor in orthography, and that causes difficulty for the NLP part. And of course, we have very few corpora available, or small ones only, if you want to go into big data approaches. So I just give you a very first impression of the status of our 6 dialect voices that we have. It's really text-to-speech. You find the text that we entered right here. So it's just a greeting to this conference, and I just play the 6 dialect voices we have, starting with the Grisons dialect.
Grüezi und herzlich willkommen zur Konferenz Swisstext 2019 Winterthur.
Okay. St. Gallen.
Grüezi und herzlich willkommen zur Konferenz Swisstext 2019 Winterthur.
Zurich.
Grüezi und herzlich willkommen zur Konferenz Swisstext 2019 Winterthur.
Grüezi und herzlich willkommen zur Konferenz Swisstext 2019 Winterthur.
Grüß dich und herzlich willkommen zur Konferenz Swisstext 2019 Winterthur. Grüezi und herzlich willkommen zur Konferenz Swisstext 2019 Winterthur.
Okay, as I said, Valais is missing, but will follow in about 2 or 3 months. This is the initial quality we have. The quality will improve over time, essentially, especially this year. And we focused first on having this topology of dialects. Actually, dialectologues in Switzerland partitioned the Swiss German-speaking part into 7 major dialect groups, and for each of them we wanted to have 1 voice. Now, I won't talk too much about the speech generation itself, but going to the text level. And of course, the most important question for text-to-speech is what kind of text are you going to use for TTS for Swiss German, since there's nothing standardized. Well, in some applications you simply have no choice at all, and that's the application which is just a link to the previous talk. If you want to read aloud, especially short messages that are written in this pseudo-phonetic form that especially younger people use nowadays, then you have no choice other than to take this as input. And this is an extremely difficult task, and work like the one presented could just come in handy for doing this. But we judged this as being too difficult for the time being. We just left it away. And for many applications, the most desirable form of input would be full-fledged Standard German, because then you could just generate from the Standard German. You could generate all dialects that you want, including also Standard German as for TTS. But however, you know that Swiss German deviates quite a lot from Standard German in wording, in word ordering, etc. So we really need a translation process from Standard German here to Swiss German. There are lexical substitutions, there's no past tense in Swiss German, etc. Actually, intriguingly so, these translation rules are relatively easy to formulate, and we tried to go in that direction, doing a rule-based transfer there, but it showed quickly that unless you have a almost 100% perfect tagging of your input, part of speech, etc., you can do more harm than good doing that. So this is really a hard translation task, and again we shifted that towards later, or leave it to the translation people. So what is easier is to use the normalized standard Swiss German, as we just heard about, as input. So you would write a sentence like, Los de Peter ist hüt go Post gegangen. So you would write it with standard German words, but in the Swiss German wording and Swiss German word order. And sometimes you have to invent standard German words, the ones marked with DD, but that's usually not a problem. This is certainly the easiest task for TTS, and somewhat awkward to write, but still might be very useful for many applications such as dialogue systems, where you have full control over the text you want to synthesize. However, there's a drawback here. Since you are so close to the Swiss German dialect, you will also have to generate different variants for different dialects. You know, for instance, that Bern and Valais dialects use the second plural as the polite form, whereas the other dialects use the third person plural as the polite form, as in Standard German. And in dialogue system, this is very important, actually. So this is something you don't want to have in your applications. So what we are envisaging here is something going away a little bit from the normalized Swiss German towards full Standard German, but just as much as to be able to use the same input for generating all dialects. So I would call this, just as a working title, dialect-independent normalized Swiss German. And we have recently gone a step into this direction. You can see this here. What we can now do is we can take a sentence and mark it up manually so far with polite form. All the words that can be affected by the polite form need to be marked up like that. We are going to automate that, of course. But then you can take the same input to generate different dialect outputs. I just play you, derived from really this input, the Grisons variant.
Da können Sie Ihre Bestellung aufgeben.
And the Bern variant.
Hier könnt ihr eure Bestellung aufgeben.
So the ones who speak Swiss German have noted the different polite forms. Another thing is that here as a word does not exist in some dialects, that has to be replaced by da. This is also done here. So with a mixture of lexical substitutions and especially this handling of polite forms should do the trick to get more or less to this dialect-independent variant Swiss German. So how do we do TTS in our case? Well, the most fashionable form nowadays is to take text as input and produce speech signal output just with end-to-end learning by neural networks, but I would have quite a few objections against doing this like that for Swiss German. It works miraculously so, but since we didn't have, there's just not enough data available to do that right now for Swiss German. So we had to treat the whole thing with a very classical or prehistoric, almost nowadays, setup. Namely, this is a classical TTS system structure, according to which most of the contemporary commercial TTS systems are built. You have basically two major parts: a front end, which converts the text into a phonological representation containing the phoneme sequence, accents, and phrase boundaries. And you have a backend that transfers this phonological representation into a speech signal. For the speech signal generation, we use what is called unit selection, that is the concatenation of recorded speech with small units going down to the half phone even sometimes. This is also the method used, for instance, in a voice like Siri. Other systems use HMM, and the newer approach is now neural network-based signal generation, which produces very nice results as well. For the text analysis part, you usually have a text preprocessing, converting abbreviations and numbers, word analysis, sentence analysis, and accentuation, prosodic phrasing, and some phonological transformations. All these modules can be implemented in many different ways, usually still a lexicon-based word analysis, but you can have rule-based and or machine learning approaches in all parts. But the structure, the overall structure is more or less the same for all TTS systems that are around today. A little bit closer look on how we do it concretely, and this is really that's completely old-fashioned probably to you, but we took this as a starting point since we knew that this approach worked well on standard languages, and we could quickly come up with a solution then for Swiss German. What we do is we take, for every word we analyze it lexically and morphologically using finite state morphology, which uses a phonetized dictionary, so we have morphemes or allomorphs as entries with the orthographic and the phonetic forms. This produces us word analysis of different variants, like for instance, this word can be spielende or spielende, an adjective or a noun, with different pronunciation, and of course it's important to get the pronunciation correct then finally. For words that are not in the, cannot be analyzed like that, we use what is called grapheme to phoneme conversion, but I won't go into that. Then we use a very classical sentence parsing actually to do the disambiguation. This is one of the tasks here, choose the right word analysis, and doing some structural analysis, which is important for doing accentuation and prosodic phrasing. So in our case, this is really phrase structure parsing, very old-fashioned, and results in a morphosyntactic tree. And from this tree, which contains all the morphological elements or lexical elements, from this tree we can easily derive a phonological representation. And we start with Standard German, and going to normalize Swiss German, the only thing we had to change here, since we have a one-to-one correspondence between the input word and the Swiss German correspondence, the only thing we had to change here was the phonetic representation in the dictionaries for all the dialects. But as I said, we want to do a little bit more, and so what we added here was a step doing some at least lexical substitutions and or insertions in our morphosyntactic tree. For instance, this here, for some dialects, this is replaced by da, and we do that really in the tree, which creates us a new tree, morphosyntactic tree, from which again we can derive the phonological representation. In some cases, this is more tricky than that. If you have the verb bekommen, which is in some dialects biko, and other dialects is überko, where you have a separable verb prefix which must be inserted somewhere else in the tree, and this is tricky, can go easily very wrong. So, but there's where it gets more difficult. But we are trying our best to go there without doing the full-fledged Standard German to Swiss German translation. But even with normalized input, we have many more problems in Swiss German than with Standard German. Just one hint here: the verb meinen, or the word meinen, can have at least these four analyses. where in Standard German you have the same pronunciation for all of these, where in Swiss German you have different pronunciations for all of them. So if you get it wrong in Standard German, you don't make a pronunciation error, but in Swiss German you will easily do. So it's really, really tough, and I always say that TTS acts like a magnifying glass for NLP errors. So, and of course we will strive toward having the best NLP possible, but in some applications you just want to get it correctly every time, and one of the major requirements then for a TTS system is that you offer correctability. So if you want to get it right, you must be able to get it right. And what we offer here is currently the possibility of marking up words by power-of-speech tag. We use the Stuttgart-Tübingen tag set that we have already seen in the previous talk for that now. And this may help, for instance, to distinguish between wies as an adjective and weiß as a verb, and so on. We'll offer in the future other markups. Sometimes you need standard German use of some words in fixed expressions or in proper names. And in extreme cases, you also want to mark up the phonetics, especially with the proper names, for instance. That is to come, but the markup of the word category or part of speech, that is already possible and works quite well. Now, what applications do we have in mind? One thing that we already deployed is an accessibility thing, namely a speaking aid for an ALS patient, which can now, instead of Standard German, communicate in Swiss German, which is a very, very nice application, of course, and we try to go there a little bit further. You can have, or we think of language learning tools, dialogue systems. As soon as ASR is ready for that, there will be a need for Swiss German output. I would recommend you to try out the Segemol app, which is a free app on iOS and Android, which is a speech-to-speech translator from several languages to Swiss German. Now we have all these 6 dialects that we can produce. We use Apple or Google ASR, depending on the phone you have, and Google Translation towards Standard German, and then just add our standard to Swiss German translation. Here you see as output the Standard German, but you will hear the Swiss German. Now, the outlook for this year at least. Unfortunately, the commercial approach didn't really work that well. So commercially, the continuation is not clear. But the project will continue. I personally am retired now, so I can spend my full time on continuing the project, but relatively alone. So I would like, so if you see possible collaborations, please approach us. I will make the use of TTS free for academic research and for some medical purposes. And throughout the 2019, we have different planned a number of improvements in dialect-specific and also generic improvements in text analysis, especially, which will improve the overall performance, hopefully very well. So, the last word. Played.
Ich finde, das langt jetzt aber.
Genau. Also tun wir uns doch zusammen verabschieden.
Vielen Dank für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit.
Okay, thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much. Any questions?
Sorry, just that maybe. How much data did you have?
Not too much actually, since we are using not big data approaches so far. The biggest resource, or the most important for us, are the phonetic dictionaries, which we built ourselves since they are not available for Swiss German. For the speech output, for the signal output, actually what we are using currently is like 3,000 sentences of spoken material, which is roughly, I would say, 2 hours of speech. And this is, by the way, this is about only maybe about 10% of what a voice like Siri uses. that's why serials are still much better. But yeah, we wanted to get somewhere with relatively little material, and it costs, of course, to have these recordings done, labeled, etc., etc. But these are the biggest resources. The rest is grammars and rules, what have you. But yeah, by the way, but we might switch soon to a big data approach in the signal generation. That's certainly something.
How would you be getting the data then?
Just record more data. Like I've been told, it's expected to take about like 10 maybe hours of compressed speech data was really to train the speech signal generation by neural network. So we should just add some more.
Yes. Having learned from you about the complexity of Swiss German compared with German of Germany, do you have an idea about the NLP regarding Arabian languages, Chinese and Hindi?
I'm not a specialist. I've been told that Arabic is obviously quite a similar situation as we have in Standard German and Swiss German, so that might be quite comparable to that. But I have no real idea, and Indian, I have no idea there. But of course you have the same situation in many places. Yeah.
Maybe just one input. Regarding translation from Standard German to Swiss German, have you used the rules developed by our colleague Scherer?
We were in contact with him, but I mean, what he basically does is more or less the same approach. But again, it's that these rules, they are so simple, and they work well if your input analysis is completely correct. They work magnificently. I mean, it's simple things like relative pronouns substitution by wo. But if you get these relative pronouns wrongly as articles because they have the same form, you just get a mess as output. This is really, and with TTS you notice every single mistake in that form. Much more than if you have like a speech inquiry system. There you can live with some errors, but you cannot in TTS. That's really crazy thing.
Last question. Next, please.
Are the resources you use available for research, or?
The resources themselves not. Or we would have to discuss that. I mean, there are very, very valuable things like the phonetic dictionaries, but of course we can discuss everything. But yeah, but the TTS system as a whole can, of course, for research, that's always available. Okay. But the resources, we would really have to see how we can do that. Maybe, I don't know, maybe in a year from now or so I will make the whole thing open source anyway, I don't know.
Or could you make
Yes, no question.
would you please just make the data at least open source?
No.
Not necessarily the dictionaries and all that, but whatever that you do end up recording, or that you have recorded now?
Sorry, I just didn't get
Just the data. Like, would you mind making that open source? Just the data?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely, at the present time. This is so valuable data, and I still actually, I mean, I financed the whole thing myself, so I would be more than happy if I got 10% back from it. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Once again, thank you very much.